Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to our NeuroSENse event, Addressing Neuromyths in Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. My name is Dr. Jo van Herwegen. I'm an Associate Professor in the Institute of Education, Department for Psychology and Human Development. I will introduce the team very briefly to you in a minute, but first want to go through some housekeeping. Tonight we'll be introducing our new awareness campaign about addressing neuromyths related to SEND, and we would very much welcome any general comments or suggestions that you may have in the chat box. There is also a Q&A that you should be able to access in case you want to ask us any questions, and there will be some time at the end of this event for you to ask questions to the panel, as well as also we welcome for you to interact with our polls, as we really welcome your input. Also to let you know that all the materials that we are presenting today are available already on our Center for Educational Neuroscience website, and we'll be showing you the links as well. Please feel free to tweet about tonight's event. Matt is going to put the hashtag into the chat if you're willing for that. So first of all, a warm welcome to all of you. And there we go. Tonight, I'll start off with presenting why neuromyths related to neurodevelopmental disorders and special educational needs and disabilities matter. And then I'll move on to a presentation by Matt Slocombe. Matt, who's a PhD student at Birkbeck and has been working on this project. So Matt, I don't know whether you can give a wave maybe. There you go. And then we'll move on to introducing the awareness campaign materials. They're not in the right order, we'll do them, but maybe Dr. Rebecca Gordon from the UCL Institute of Education will be doing a presentation. Rebecca, would you mind giving a wave? And then we have Professor Chloë Marshall, also from UCL Institute of Education. Thank you, Chloe. Myself and Matt. We'll then be joined by Jamie Galpin, who will be joining us in just a few minutes from NeuroSENse, as NeuroSENse has been a partner in this project. And then finally, but not least, Professor Michael Thomas will be giving some further comments as Director for the Center of Educational Neuroscience. So that's about tonight's events and what we're going to be doing. Oh, here we go. I already put the hashtag here on this one. We'll be conducting a number of polls tonight. So as you can see, there's the Q&A, should be at the bottom there. At the end, we'll launch some polls that you can find there in the middle if you want to respond to it, in the middle of your screen. And there's also a chat function. I am now going to move on to our first part of the session, and which is around neuromyths in SEND and why are they a problem, or why should we, why do they matter, why should we be bothered about them? And just a brief presentation. Neuromyths are common incorrect beliefs that people may hold about the brain, and these myths are often based on simplifications or incorrect interpretations of real scientific findings. But their myth status comes from the fact that they remain endorsed whilst it's actually been shown in science that these beliefs are incorrect. And in our latest research, we examined the neuromyths that teachers as well as educational professionals endorse and compared these endorsements to beliefs that members of the general public hold. And we examined the neuromyths related to general facts about the brain, but also neurodevelopmental disorders. I just want to, before we move on around what we did in the study and found, just highlight the fact that we'll be using tonight the term disorder, and we accept that there is a continuum of variation and diversity within individuals. But we just wanted to mention that we're using these labels because we think they could be helpful within research and as a starting point. And that's how I'll be using them tonight in the context of this particular study. So in our study, we focused on the most common neurodevelopmental disorders in the UK, including autism, as well as dyslexia, ADHD, Down syndrome, and general learning difficulties. And we focused on particular neuromyths such as people with autism do not like to be touched. In ADHD, special diets such as reduced sugar are an effective treatment for ADHD. Dyslexia can be helped by using colored lenses or colored overlays. Children with Down syndrome cannot learn anything complex, as well as what a child with learning difficulties can understand can be measured by what a child can actually say. In terms of our methods, so we looked at some general neuromyths, as I mentioned, so these were 15 false or true statements about the brain, as well as then some of the statements, 30 statements related to neurodevelopmental disorders, of which I've just presented a few to you. In terms of participants, we had over 500 responders that completed the survey, including 203 who worked in education, as well as 366 members of the general public. We already presented our findings in more detail in our previous event, so I'm not going to go through them in much detail, but to highlight that there were no significant differences between those who worked in education and members of the general public, neither for endorsing facts related to the brain or those related to neurodevelopmental disorders. There was, however, in both groups, knowledge about the general brain was better than compared to knowledge related to neurodevelopmental disorders. And what we did find is that people who accessed information about the brain did better in both groups. In addition, we also found that there were some differences related to different neuromyths that were endorsed for the different neurodevelopmental disorders that we looked in. And one of the groups where actually there were fewer neuromyths endorsed for was autism. And what we discuss in the paper is that we know that there are a number of awareness initiatives that have been taking place improving knowledge about autism. And so what we suggest in the paper is that awareness initiatives might actually pay dividends when it comes to neuromyths. So why does endorsements of neuromyths matter? Well, and first of all, there isn't much evidence around how much these myths impact on teaching and learning. And actually one study that looked at teachers who have won awards and whether or not they endorsed neuromyths did not find any differences between teachers who had won awards for best practice in education and those who had not won awards in terms of how many neuromyths these teachers endorsed. However, what we do know though is that when teachers endorse neuromyths, they often adopt practices that are linked to these incorrect beliefs. For example, and I'm sure as well later on we'll touch on some of them as well, is that when teachers endorse that, for example, dyslexia may be related to some of the visual problems, that then these teachers might actually endorse the use of visual overlays, whereas research shows that there is actually no direct relationship between the use of visual overlays and improvements around dyslexia. Furthermore, dyslexia can also, endorsing of neuromyths can also be the basis of stigma. And children who, when teachers endorse neuromyths, it might lead to the fact that children, for example, it's often, or teachers sometimes endorse that ADHD might be caused by intake of sugar, for example, and it might lead to children not getting, saying that children shouldn't be eating chocolate because that might increase their ADHD. Also, when it comes to not receiving the support they might need, when teachers or people endorse that dyslexia or children with dyslexia show letter reversals, whereas again, research has shown that not only children with dyslexia show letter reversals, but that this is common in all children, or in some children, but also those who do not meet the diagnostic criteria for dyslexia. When teachers endorse these kind of neuromyths, it might then lead to the fact that a child who has dyslexia might not be referred for a formal diagnosis or receive support if this child does not show letter reversals. So there are a number of ways in which these neuromyths can actually impact in the type of support or the educational practices that happen in classrooms. So then how can we best address some of these neuromyths? It's been suggested that better communication between neuroscientists and educators will be a good way forward, especially because we know that some of these neuromyths are grounded in the fact that there's a difficulty in translation from the findings from neuroscientists and the practices or the outcomes of this research. We also know that critical reflection can help in terms of what do we really endorse and what is the evidence for the beliefs that we have. There's also been some research suggesting that training programs can really help here. So this was a study by Letby and Harris that found that actually a very short training course with teachers helps their practice and the endorsement of neuromyths. And as I mentioned already before, in our own research and in the paper, we find that there are differences between the different neurodevelopmental disorders and groups of children, and that there might be a link between the endorsement of neuromyths and awareness campaigns around this. So thank you for listening, and I will now pass on to Matt.
Thanks, Jo. So I'm just going to say a few words now about the focus groups, which was the next stage in this project. And I'd like to start by thanking Kerry Murphy, who actually organised and ran and did much of the work for these focus groups, and also to the teachers and teaching assistants and SENCOs who gave up their time and joined in with the groups and shared their expertise. So why did we conduct these groups? Well, we wanted to better understand teachers' experience of the kind of myths that we found in the scoping study. We wanted to know more about what causes myths to emerge and how they spread, and what steps can we take to start addressing myths in special educational needs. So if you can move to the next slide, Jo. So we conducted 3 online focus groups, and we invited various different professionals who are involved in the support of children with special educational needs, including teaching assistants, SENCOs, and school leaders and teachers. And over the course of these 3 focus groups, several themes emerged, and we've used these to inform the materials that we're going to describe shortly. So I'll just tell you about a few of these now. Jo, can you move to the next slide, please? So one of the main themes that emerged related to kind of knowledge and understanding. So many of the participants who took part in the focus groups communicated that understanding specific labels such as autism or ADHD and strategies that are linked to these is fairly common. What they would like to know more about is knowledge of what these labels actually mean in terms of the strengths and weaknesses and different traits that different developmental disorders can have. Many of the people who attended the groups also communicated they didn't really know a lot about these myths. So, and that was part of the reason why they joined these groups as well. If you can move to the next slide, Jo. Another theme that emerged related to working together. So many of the TAs and teachers and SENCOs and leaders we spoke to communicated that they would really like to spend more time speaking with their colleagues, discussing the support that they give children. However, they don't have enough time to do that. There's a real lack of time in order to do that. And in many cases, there isn't the kind of infrastructure in schools that allow that kind of prolonged, ongoing discussion that they thought would be really beneficial in helping addressing neuromyths. Another working together point was to do with researchers. So many of the group members communicated that they would like to engage with research and speak with researchers, although again, they didn't have a lot of time to be able to do that. And there was a little opportunity for them to do that as well. And they also communicated that researchers need to adapt their language and communicate clearly when speaking to teachers as well. If you can move to the next slide, Joe. In terms of training, many of the people we spoke to felt that they would like more training, and then it should be regular and ongoing. And it wasn't always clear where they can go to source high quality training from as well. If you go to the next slide, Joe. And then finally, we wanted to find out about how, what can we do now to as something immediately to support addressing myths. Who should we be speaking to? Everybody we spoke to said, well, we need to be speaking to all kind of people who are involved in the support of children, so TAs, leadership, teachers, and that we should differentiate the kind of material that we're making in terms of blogs, some videos, online CBD sessions, and school posters. And so this is the kind of format that we've taken forward. And I'll hand over to Joe now, who's going to start talking about some of these materials.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. So that was our starting point, and from there we developed some materials, as Matt said, and I'm very pleased. I have to stop sharing and share something else now, because what I would like to share with you is the website and materials that we've created for this awareness campaign. So please bear with me so I can find where we've got the right slides. Oh, apologies for that. So this always works better when you're practicing than when you're doing it in reality. Here we go. So this is what I'm very pleased. So this is a new page on the Center of Educational Neuroscience website, where you can find out more information about the NeuroSENse projects overall. But very importantly, on the resources web page, you will find our new awareness materials. So awareness campaign materials. And the first one I would like to introduce to you is this infographic we've created. So the reason why we've created this infographic is because we all have unconscious biases. For example, I think I may be biased to like chocolate that is labeled from Belgium, simply because I'm Belgian myself, so I particularly like Belgian chocolate. However, a friend once tricked me by putting Swiss chocolate into Belgian packaging, and to be honest, I couldn't taste the difference, showing that actually I have an unconscious bias towards maybe the wrong type of chocolate. And there are a number of biases that can explain neuromyths. So we have, mentioned it already before, the simplicity bias, so that people tend to have a bias towards simpler explanations and solutions, but also the confirmatory bias, so people tend to believe things that they've experienced themselves, even when science shows that the opposite is true. Believing in placebo effects, maybe. The social desirability bias, that people tend to prefer knowledge or outcomes that are socially desirable. And these are just a few biases that can be linked to neuromyths. Now, the reason why I'm saying all of this is because research that has looked into how we can address biases has shown that there are a number of ways that can be used to address these biases. And so we've created, based upon this knowledge, an infographic that explains in 5 steps the 5 steps that can be used to bust neuromyths. So first of all, the first step that can be taken is to develop professional knowledge. I'm not going to read out the complete infographic, because I'm sure that you may want to read this in your own time and think about this, but developing professional knowledge is an important aspect of this. Secondly, and understanding individual differences. We've mentioned before that labels can be a good starting point for understanding children's needs and linking them to supports, but obviously also understanding the individual strengths and weaknesses of children and how that might link to support is important. And developing that professional knowledge of common developmental disorders that goes in point 1, but also engaging on reflection, which is our next point, as well as communicating with colleagues, is important in understanding these individual differences. So in terms of individual reflection, which is step 3, we would argue or advocate that ongoing reflective practice and communication with colleagues can really help to develop teaching expertise and knowledge on children's individual support needs. And one way that might be used to helping with this reflection or collecting evidence relating to this reflection is by, for example, keeping a diary of what worked and what didn't work within different scenarios or different lessons, and then reflecting maybe with colleagues around what that means in practice. We also know as step 4, we would argue for a whole school communication, as Matt already mentioned, that came out of our focus groups. The SENS support works best when teachers, assistants, SANCOs, and school leaders all come together and share knowledge, but work together as well. And develop an ongoing SEND working group was one of the suggestions made by our focus group members, which we think indeed might be a good way forward. And finally, our step number 5 would be reach out to experts. If you're unsure about whether something is true or a neuromyth, reach out to us. And we're not saying that we know all of the answers yet, but we'd be very happy to find out where more information is needed and what we can do to support practitioners in the classroom. So this is our infographic, which you can download from our website, maybe hang in the staff room or share with colleagues who might be interested in this. However, in addition to this, we also have some additional materials, such as our blogs. And I'm now going to pass on to Matt, who's going to share the first blog or introduce the first blog. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Shall I share my screen, Joe? So do you want to take yours? Brilliant. So one of the blogs that we is to do with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is more commonly known as ADHD. And ADHD is characterized by impulsivity, hyperactivity, and poor attentional control. There are different subtypes of ADHD. So there's an inattentive subtype, where children who have an inattentive subtype have more difficulties with their attention, but are have less problems with hyperactivity. There's a hyperactive subtype, and who have more difficulties with their hyperactivity, but less with attention, and there's a combined subtype. So not all children with ADHD are hyperactive or inattentive. They can be mixed across these different domains. It's a fairly common disorder. It's estimated that approximately 1.7 children in the UK have a diagnosis of ADHD. And these children with ADHD, they can struggle with controlling their attention and behavior. They might flip from task to task, or they might be stuck on doing one task for a prolonged period of time. They can have difficulties in organizing their thoughts, finding the right words to communicate what they want to say, and their actions. And they can also have difficulty with regulating emotions. So these can all impact outcomes, educational outcomes for children with ADHD, as well as mental health. And there's three neuromyths that we discussed in the blog. The first is that ADHD is a childhood disorder. And this used to be the consensus, that it used to be thought that ADHD is a childhood disorder, and then children grow out of it as they go into their 20s. Although studies have now shown that at least 15% of children with ADHD continue to meet the full diagnostic criteria in adulthood, and an additional 50% report significant ADHD-related symptoms or impairments in adulthood. So it's often a lifelong condition, even though a lot of people think it's a childhood disorder. Another myth we discuss in the blog is that sugar causes ADHD. And while a balanced diet is necessary to maintain good brain health and cognitive functioning, the evidence that sugar causes ADHD But well, there isn't really much evidence at all, and the evidence for dietary interventions is mixed and inconclusive. This isn't to say that certain diets can't help in some ways, but it's quite complex, and it's not very well known, and it's important to speak to medical professionals before changing diets and things like that. The last myth we discuss is that ADHD medication can lead to substance misuse. So ADHD is associated with higher rates of substance misuse in later life, although because ADHD is characterized by impulsivity and emotional dysregulation, or can have these traits, these themselves can lead to substance misuse. And the research looking at how stimulant medication affects people with ADHD in terms of substance misuse is quite mixed, although there's no evidence to suggest that stimulant medication increases substance misuse. Some of the studies show that it has no effect, and some studies show that it reduces substance misuse, but there's none, as I said, there's none to suggest that it increases substance misuse. So this is, I encourage you to go and have a look at the blog, and you can find out about these in more detail. And I'll hand over to Jo to introduce our next.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm just going to, if you could stop sharing. Yeah, there you go. Then I can share and introduce, because the next blog that we created, or to be fair, was created by Professor Chloë Marshall. And Chloë, would you like to say something about the blog around deafness?
Thank you. Yes, I will, Jo. I don't have any fancy slides for this. It's just me for the next 3 minutes. So good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about deafness and neuromyths in deafness. Now, you might never have taught a deaf child before. Permanent deafness is actually quite a low incidence occurrence, so around 1 or 2 in every 1,000 births. And the most severely and profoundly deaf children are likely to be using a cochlear implant. And most deaf children are educated in mainstream schools. Now, what usually happens is that the deaf child is the only deaf child in their school, with pupils and teachers and support staff who know nothing about deafness. So there's likely to be no collective expertise on deafness in mainstream schools. Whereas in specialist schools for the deaf, of course, this expertise has been built up and an environment created that's much more conducive to supporting the learning of deaf children. Now, deafness is not a learning disability per se, but challenges in speech, language, and communication can, for many deaf children, act as a barrier to learning. And there are 3 neuromyths that we identify in this blog, 3 neuromyths surrounding deafness that are really important to dispel. So neuromyth number 1 is that using a cochlear implant cures deafness. It allows deaf children to regain normal hearing and to learn to speak so well that they will achieve age-appropriate language skills. This is wrong. Cochlear implants do not restore normal hearing. It takes a great deal of time and effort to learn how to interpret those electrical signals that are provided by the cochlear implant. And it takes time to interpret those as speech. So how well children learn to hear with an implant and how well they learn spoken language varies widely between children and for reasons that we don't yet fully understand. So that's neuromyth number 1. Neuromyth number 2 is that cochlear implanted children should not be exposed to a sign language because this will impede their ability to learn spoken language. This is wrong. There is no causal evidence for any negative impact of sign language exposure on spoken language outcomes. In fact, it seems to be the contrary is true, that implanted children who are born into deaf families and who learn sign language from the start tend to perform well on spoken language assessments. And sign language knowledge also scaffolds deaf children in learning to read the written form of a spoken language. So that's a good thing, of course. Another third neuromyth, neuromyth number 3, is about the sensitive period for language acquisition. This neuromyth suggests that a sensitive period for language acquisition, for sign language acquisition is longer than the sensitive period for spoken language acquisition. And therefore, spoken language should be given priority when deaf children are very young. And again, this neuromyth is wrong. It's certainly the case that cochlear implantation is more successful the younger it's carried out. But the sensitive period for language acquisition is most likely to be independent of modality. In other words, relevant to both spoken language and sign language. And in any case, speed is of the essence. Why would you wait to provide an accessible language, a sign language, when delaying language input is going to have knock-on effects for academically relevant aspects of cognition, such as executive functions? So there we go, 3 neuromyths dispelled. I want to finish by alerting you to a free online deaf awareness course that my colleagues and I at UCL have developed. It's aimed at school staff. Oh, there we go. Joe is showing you the link on our handy blog to where it is. If you can't find the link, then just email me and I'll direct you to it. But this is a free online deaf awareness course for educators. So please spread the word, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for introducing the blog and for obviously also writing the blog in the first place. Our third blog will be introduced by Dr. Rebecca Gordon, who will be talking about our blog on dyslexia.
Thanks, Joe. So dyslexia, I mean, a lot of people are aware of this developmental disorder. Children tend to receive a diagnosis of dyslexia if they demonstrate problems with reading and spelling, beyond those that can typically be explained by lower levels of intelligence or lack of exposure to education, etc., or some form of childhood trauma. But the thing is that diagnosis of dyslexia varies in terms of the rates of diagnosis, varies on the report source. So it can range quite a lot, from about 5% to about 20%. And of course, without the problem is that in order to get a diagnosis, there needs to be some sort of awareness originally, some sort of trigger. And there are obstacles in recognizing these early signs of dyslexia, which typically a parent or teacher would think, oh, okay, something going on here. Let's have a look at, let's talk to an ed site or something like that. So what's this got to do with neuromyths? So the problem is that early signs can be muddied or ignored or even misinterpreted if there are neuromyths abound, you know, if people are aware of these neuromyths and actually believe them to be true. And in my blog, I talk about 3 of these, one of which is visual stress or visual-based problems, where it's thought that children have sensations of distortions and discomfort when they're reading, or or they reverse letters, like a D to a B or a D to a B. Visual stress, I mean, this comes from the original diagnosis of word blindness for dyslexia, but this is not something that's typically related to dyslexia or has been shown to predict a later diagnosis of dyslexia. Earlier, Joe talked about letter reversal. And again, this is something that is a typical stage of development and can be and cannot be present in all children. So this means that children who later go on to get a diagnosis of dyslexia or may actually have dyslexia, undiagnosed, never actually do this reversal thing. So that's the first neuromyth. The second one is this right brain dominance idea, though the right brain dominance side of it is those words are less often used, but this idea that people with dyslexia are in some way more creative, because there was this original thought that the right brain is more related to creativity and the left brain more related to logical thought, comes from lateralization research, but it was dispelled back in the 80s. But there's still this idea that people with dyslexia are more creative and are better at problem solving and lateral thinking, etc. And the third neuromyth we look at is it's similar to what Matt was saying earlier, this idea that when children grow up and learn to read and spell, dyslexia goes away. They're no longer dyslexic. And this again is not true. But what's really problematic about this is that these neuromyths can often come from reliable and reputable sources. So there are some well-meaning organizations like the NHS website on dyslexia, the Dyslexia Association, dyslexia.com, British Dyslexia Association, and countless education tools on the market that talk about symptoms of early signs of dyslexia are reversing letters, visual stress, children having stronger verbal abilities, increased creativity, etc. And so these, as I was saying, these are problematic because they are barriers to diagnosis, and I talk about this more in the blog. But what is important, the reason it's important to talk about these neuromyths is so that people are aware that an absence of these symptoms does not mean the child can't have dyslexia. So it's not that, oh, well, they don't reverse letters, they're not particularly creative, or maybe they're just, you know, lazy or worse, stupid, you know, it's awful. So in short, it's so that people are not looking for the wrong thing. So it's not just about, but on top of that, it's not just about people being aware of the wrong symptoms. There are other symptoms of dyslexia that people are less aware of, which the sort of the neuromyths tend to overtake. So symptoms of forgetfulness, not being able to follow instructions as well as their peers, time management, problems with attention. These are all early signs of dyslexia. So what we want to do via the blog and the video explainer is that advanced creativity, don't look for advanced creativity, don't look for letter reversal, be aware of these actual symptoms. But lastly, also the third neuromyth that I talked about, which was that dyslexia doesn't go away once adults grow up and learn to read and spell. There are symptoms of dyslexia, and this is an emerging body of research that are lifelong. So adults grow up and they go to higher education and they go out to work and they have these problems with attention, memory, time management, etc. That do require, the same as with children in school, some form of reasonable adjustment so that they can perform as well as their peers. So all this in the blog and the explainer, but I think it was a bit over 3 minutes, but thank you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for your introduction and for the blog as well. I'm now going to pass on again to Matt, who's going to introduce our blog on autism. Matt, did you want to share again, or? I
don't need to share for this one. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so the blog that we've written about is on autism. So autism is predominantly diagnosed on the basis of differences in social communication and interaction and repetitive and restrictive behaviors. And autistic children may also experience sensory information differently to non-autistic children. They may have increased or decreased sensitivity to pain or touch and sound. And autism often co-occurs with other diagnoses, such as, in particular, anxiety. It's a fairly common condition. It's estimated that around 1 to 2% of children in the UK are diagnosed with autism. And it's often described as a spectrum condition. And this means that there's no one set of autistic traits that all autistic children share. They have different profiles of strengths and challenges across a range of different traits. And how much these traits can impact their lives can also vary considerably. So there's a few different myths that we discuss in the blog. I'll just discuss 3 of them here. One is the idea that autism or autistic children lack empathy. Which is wrong. And so some autistic children might have difficulty in quickly picking up on the subtle social cues that convey how somebody is feeling in certain contexts. They might find broader, generalizable emotions quicker to pick up on, such as happiness or sadness. And they might find more complex and context-bound emotional concepts more challenging to quickly interpret, such as frustrated or bored. But this shouldn't be confused with a lack of understanding how other people think. They might also understand how someone thinks, but communicate and respond in a different way. They might be over-aroused by other people's emotions and become too overwhelmed and need to have some time for themselves. So all of these kind of different behaviors, different ways in interacting in a different way are very different to a lack of empathy. The second myth, or another myth we discuss, is that children with autism are unable to notice social rejection. So autistic children, some of them might communicate differently in social situations. They might avoid direct eye contact, or they might want to spend time on their own. But this doesn't mean that they're not interested in social relationships or enjoy social relationships and value friendships. They absolutely, or notice social rejection. And in fact, loneliness can be a bit of a problem with some children in autism because of this. And another myth we discuss is that autism only occurs in boys. So 3 to 5 times as many boys are diagnosed with autism than girls. However, because boys and girls have different social experiences and lots of autistic traits relate to social interaction, it's thought that boys and girls can develop different ways of interacting in the social worlds because of these different socialization effects. So girls might be quieter than boys, or they might be more adept at masking traits. And it's actually believed that autism might be underdiagnosed in girls, and a lot more research needs to be done in this area. So so this is the yeah, I'll hand over to you now, Jo. Thank you for listening. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Matt, for writing the blog and for introducing it as well. And I think that leaves one more blog around intellectual disability more generally, and that's up to me to introduce that one. So intellectual disabilities is a term used when there are limits to a person's ability to learn at an expected level and function in daily life. However, there are different levels of intellectual disabilities, and these levels are often measured by scores on IQ tests. But as I mentioned before, it's not just IQ scores that define intellectual disabilities, it's also around what that means in terms of functioning in daily life. So, for example, whilst some individuals have profound learning or intellectual disabilities, others have only mild or moderate difficulties. Now, the discussion of neuromyths related to intellectual disabilities or learning difficulties is not new. So when I was doing my research, I found that actually in 1977, there was already a paper published by William Cruikshank named Myths and Realities in Learning Disabilities, which was published in the Journal of Learning Disabilities. Although not all points considered in his address would currently still hold, but he makes a number of very interesting points and observations. So, for example, he explains how learning in children with disabilities is often seen as limited or a concern for medics and medication only, but not really a concern for education or for teachers. And he also notices or mentions in his article that teachers, I would add by no fault of their own, are often ill-prepared to address issues related to developmental disability. And so it's interesting to read how some of these concerns raised by William Cruikshank still hold today. Indeed, in our own research and previous research around neuromyths related to intellectual disabilities has shown that a few neuromyths still hold about individuals with intellectual disabilities, despite all the research that has been carried out. So 3 of these neuromyths that we address in our blog, and maybe I should share them with you now, relate to the fact that the learning outcomes of those with intellectual disabilities cannot be improved by education, that those with intellectual disabilities cannot learn anything complex, and what a child with learning difficulties can understand can be measured by what a child can say. I'm not going to expand too much on these today, because I would welcome you to read them in the blog with the evidence related to it. But in the blog, we aim to raise awareness about these neuromyths and explain the evidence around the development of the brain or neuroscience that may be at the core of these neuromyths. It's also important to remember that people often have neuromyths because they have an interest in something that is extremely complex, namely brain development in populations with intellectual disabilities. Sorry, I was just trying to think. And it's important to reflect, but it's also important to reflect why endorsing these neuromyths actually matters. So in the past, many people with Down syndrome, for example, did not receive education and were locked away simply because it was believed that they could not learn anything complex or contribute anything to society. And I'm going to challenge this here because we might think that this has changed. But the employment rates, for example, of people with intellectual disabilities is still very low, at only 5% of adults with learning disabilities aged 18 to 64 are actually in paid employment today. So here's my plea that we need to address these neuromyths related to neurodevelopmental disorders that have been presented and intellectual disabilities because it still matters. And I hope as such that the blog can make a difference or at least a starting point for addressing these. So those are the blogs we've written so far. We also can announce that we're going to launch in the next month, as part of this awareness campaign, some video explainers that will give a visual representation of some of the neuromyths. So please keep an eye out for those. So that was the introduction of our awareness campaign and the materials related to that. But I very much now, I'll stop sharing, would welcome Jamie Galpin from NeuroSENse, who has been our partner in this project, and allow him to say a few things around the awareness campaign. Thank you, Jamie.
Hi, Joe, and thank you very much for that. It's a really kind of fantastic project. And when Joe first spoke to us about partnering with them on this, we were delighted because it's a really important piece of work. I know you'll have spoken before about the potential detrimental impact of some of these neuromyths in terms of the potential for it to create stigma, or stereotypes, or impact on perceptions that we might hold, and to create self-fulfilling prophecies around what children and young people can or importantly cannot do. I think some of the other things that it was great at this sort of project are sort of twofold. It allows practitioners to take a moment just to reflect on practice, and notably some of the theories which we think might underpin some of our practice. So there's opportunity for critical reflection so that we're not just trapped in unexamined judgments, interpretations, or assumptions and expectations. So we start to question some of the reasons for our practice, particularly those that we might feel are really well founded because of that notion of saying the seductive allure of neuroscience explanations, that idea that anything with a neuro prefix trumps everything else, and therefore this must be the case, this must be what's happening, without actually examining where did that information come from, and is it actually a myth there? So we can start to become aware of those sort of tacit frames for practice, and that then opens up more alternative possibilities for action when we get to question some of those assumptions we have. You know, a session such as this, I think, really invites us to challenge our professional practice, but also some of what we thought was academic theory that might explain the practice that we've got. And I think it can also help to just draw attention to the uncertainty that is part of the scientific process, that we're constantly sort of questioning or striving towards, trying to enhance our knowledge. But there's always caveats in terms of that it's never as simple as being something that's black and white. And I think that's something that very much is reflected in practice too, that pedagogy is really rooted in uncertainty and risk-taking. We're constantly sort of trying something out, trying to find something. There's never any, this is the way to do it. This is the way to support all these children. This is the way to support all of these categorical distinctions and interventions that might be built around those categorical distinctions. We're slowly starting to understand, and not as concrete as we might have thought before. And one of the other things that's great about the project is, and I know we've spoken about it more, is this opening up a dialogue across different professionals. so particularly research and practice. And it's dialogue such as this that I think is one of the key ways of addressing that research to practice, practice to research gap that we know perseverates across lots of different areas, but particularly when we look at special education. So we've got education more broadly, and we know within SEN in particular that there is that sort of gap that exists. So projects such as this that open up that dialogue, that allow that critical questioning, that sort of back and forth between researchers and practitioners is highly beneficial, and I think something that will only serve to enhance both sides in terms of making sure that we're able to carry out more effective research that's more easily translatable. And it can also then ensure that we're enhancing practice, and essentially that information isn't siloed across different individuals. And so it's something that we're very keen at NASEN on doing, on facilitating that knowledge transfer. And it's why we're so excited and pleased to support the work being done by the NeuroSENse team.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for your nice comments on the project and for indeed in working, helping facilitate that dialogue between researchers and practitioners. That is very helpful. And I will now pass on to Professor Michael Thomas as Director for the Centre of Educational Neuroscience to look at what we've done so far, but also the future ahead.
Thanks very much, Jo. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this awareness campaign with the NeuroSENse team. I'm very excited to see all the materials that have come out, the blogs, the infographics, the podcasts. I'm excited about forthcoming materials as well. We have some explainer videos, which will be coming out in the next few weeks, which I think are a really engaging way to communicate some of the research findings and their practical relevance on the different kinds of types of struggling learners that we're talking about today. If you read the Times educational supplement, this is this week's, and you'll see there's a brain on the front. So I encourage you to have a look at this. It's, I think, a balanced article that gives an overview of what we're trying to do in this campaign, but also talks about some of the challenges we face, and I'll come to those in a moment. So I want to contextualize a little bit this campaign in terms of the broader goals of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience. Our broader aims are to try and harness the new research findings in psychology and in neuroscience to see if we can translate those into a form that can be helpful in the classroom and can improve educational outcomes. A crucial part of that is getting feedback and establishing a dialogue with practitioners, educators, teachers, about how research can be used, particularly if you take the area of developmental disorders. That there are decades of basic research as we've begun to understand the different types of disorders, how they can vary, what types of disorders tend to co-occur with each other. And I do feel there's very rich potential to make better use of that research base to offer up possibilities to practitioners and teachers in the classroom. Of course, even though you're seeing brains on the front of magazines like this, we don't think brains are everything in education. There's plenty to education, much beyond neuroscience. But we do think that if you understand how brains work and how brains can work differently, that this could be useful for educators and practitioners. And we're very keen to build those bridges and take advantage of possible dialogues. Maybe I'll just take a few moments to talk about some of our other projects to give a wider sense of what we do at the Centre for Educational Neuroscience. One of the projects we've been working on is to develop a new learning activity for primary age children to help children learn counterintuitive concepts in maths and science. We recently established the effectiveness of this new activity in a sample of over 6,000 children across the UK in a randomized controlled trial funded by the Educational Endowment Foundation. We're also working with a team at Imperial College London to explore the effects of mobile phone use and gaming devices and social media on cognitive development in teenagers, and again a large UK sample, and examining the impact on educational outcomes and on mental health. In another project we've been developing in a work with UNESCO and with the World Bank, and now working with charities to explore how we can improve the effectiveness of adult literacy programs in low-income countries in Africa. So that gives a feel that a range of activities where we think that there's more to be got out of basic research findings to help improve educational outcomes. So you've heard today about neuromyths. For me, I'm very ambivalent about neuromyths. Sometimes I think they're a good thing, right? A good thing because they show that the teachers, parents, the general public do think the brain is going to be relevant to things like education, that understanding how the brain works can be useful. So in a sense, I encourage that. Obviously, the downside is that there can be miscommunication in the forms of myths, and that says that we as scientists are not doing our job well enough, and we need to have awareness campaigns like this to make a better effort at getting our message across. And of course, as Joe mentioned, the downside risk of that miscommunication is then you can end up seeing ineffective methods being used in the classroom. So I think there is a lot of potential in the decades of research on developmental disorders and being able to translate that. I would say a couple more things about that. First, we are aware of significant challenges in the work we're trying to do. One of them is the way research has gone about studying disorders is to focus quite narrowly on individual categories, to assign labels, to, in some senses, ignore comorbidity and just focus on one disorder at a time. And we know that's quite unrealistic. In the majority of cases, children are presenting complex needs, and that in turn requires complex responses from educators and practitioners. The second challenge, in a sense, is the very term disorders. We are aware that some people view struggling learners, children in the classroom, as just instances of different ways that brains can develop and cognition can work. And we're very sensitive to this diversity perspective. On the other hand, we're also aware that if you're looking at children who are struggling in the classroom, if you simply view them as different, this can serve to undermine the triggering of the support that those children need. So we are aware of these kind of debates, and we're very sympathetic towards them, and keen to contribute to these kind of debates. I'd say that another challenge is for me the $64 million question, if that amount hasn't increased with inflation now. What is it that educators need to know about neuroscience? I don't think you guys should be reading neuroscience papers, but what is it that you should take from how the brain works that might be useful in the classroom? If I knew the answer to that, I'd be a much richer man than I am now. But I think the awareness campaign, the materials you're seeing today and will be coming out over the next few weeks are one of our attempts to try and summarize what we think the information is that you kind of need to know. The second thing I'd say is that this is not really an activity that researchers can do on their own. We are super keen to hear from practitioners, to hear from educators about how we can take the basic research and turn it into a way that is maximally useful for practitioners, for teachers, and indeed for parents. So on that note, I'd like to hand back to Joe, who has some exciting polls where we can gather some of that information. So many thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's exactly what I was going to say. Maybe we'll launch the polls. We've got time for questions to the panels. So whilst you do the polls or you've got a question, please put any questions you may have on the Q&A, so it's easier for us. So I've launched the polls now. Hopefully you'll find for any questions you may have in the Q&A chat. And I welcome the panel as well to look at questions in the chat and Q&A so that we can maybe see who can provide some answers to them.
So in case people didn't hear, because I think you broke up a little bit there, Joe, if you have questions, if you could add them to the Q&A box, that will allow us to locate all of the questions in one place. And thank you.
Hi, sorry, Maureen has said, noticing in practice an increasing overlap in students with dyslexia diagnosis and who have traits of ADHD. Yes, I actually just reviewed a paper on this. And yet that is, there's more and more research going into that, though it's been around for a while, and it suggests that it's the attentional component that is possibly the differentiator. So there's a lot of overlap, but it's the type of attentional deficits that are that separate ADHD from dyslexia. And I can't remember the details, so I don't want to lie, but it's something to do with the distractors are internal or external, but I don't want to go into that too much. But all I want to say is that there is definitely research around this overlap in adults and in children between AD and HD from the attentional component that I touched on briefly when I was talking.
Thank you very much. There's another question from Maureen around in the UK, do we think that the assessment system or way, how we focus on assessment and learning, whether that causes some of the problems related to neuromyths and how resources are provided? And I think that came out, Maureen, in our discussions with the practitioners in the focus groups, who actually said, because many practitioners are very busy, I don't think it's just the fact that it's the assessment per se or only that is the issue here, but the fact that educators are continuously under pressure to deliver a lot of content and to do a lot of tasks in a small amount of time. And it doesn't really allow for reflection sometimes, and for them to then reach for example, off-the-shelf solutions, resources, rather than being able to engage with what kind of resource would work for what particular child. And practitioners mentioned visual overlays as was one of these resources that are off the shelf available that might help a child and therefore reach for them. I hope that answers a little bit of your question. I don't know whether I think this might be a question for Michael Thomas, if that's okay. So there's a question from Faith here around what is neuroscience going to change or going to have as a change for the education sector? Is that a question you're willing to take?
Yeah. So I think one has to take a view of that in different time frames, and what's going to happen tomorrow is probably very little. We're in a kind of scientific approach, you're gradually trying to accumulate an evidence base of understanding how the brain works, how that places constraints on learning, and if you have those constraints on learning, how would you alter educational techniques? So some of that is a kind of slow approach. Certainly you're looking at some of the work today about debunking neuromyths, about improving the communication about what we do know right now. So that's kind of more an immediate approach. I think more broadly in educational neuroscience, we think of two different ways that neuroscience can link through to educational implications. One of those is a route where the more we understand how the brain works, we can improve our psychological theories of learning. So understanding about the regimes over which we have to repeat information or encourage our students and pupils to think about materials and how that engages the kind of learning mechanisms and the role sleep plays in consolidating information, that these feed into better ways to do teaching. But that will be through improving our, as it were, our theories of learning. But we can also think of more direct mappings to think about, in a sense of kind of brain health, about the brain as a biological organ. And although neuroscience and the brain is just a small part of education, and there are plenty more issues to do with the school environment and the syllabus and policies and so forth, which span beyond education, the home environment and so forth. If we can understand about how to put each child's brain in the classroom in the best position to learn, in terms of nutrition, in terms of sleep, in terms of avoidance of stress, these kind of things can at least make sure that there are not other factors which are impairing learning once you expose children to the best learning environments.
Well, thank you very much, Michael Thomas, for that answer. Yeah, Jamie, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just you know, sort of echoing slightly some of those things, but also I think for me, one of the exciting areas where it can potentially help us is, you know, looking at some of the work that's currently being carried out around kind of transdiagnostic understanding of difference. And when we're looking at a perspective of support in schools, that position of understanding universal difficulties that children and young people might have is going to really help in terms of support that we're putting in place. It can hopefully move us away from this idea of inclusion being the piecemeal adoption of isolated interventions for distinct diagnostic categories, and instead recognize those boundaries are quite porous, and instead try to focus on some of the universal support that we can put in place, some of those inclusion by design principles. And so I hope we're going to have more support there to really empower teachers to be doing some of that practice.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie, for raising that. In terms of ways forward, we hope within the Centre of Educational Neuroscience that we'll obtain funding to really look at that and to do a systematic review around what works for different groups and what works in terms of what's the overlap, so that we kind of get those universal strategies into the classroom, but then using the evidence, being evidence-based. There are a number of questions, and I'm still going to try and take as many as we can. One of the questions came from, sorry, I need to scroll up now. Alice is asking around, could they be translated, our blogs? And I'm sure that we can look into this for other countries and languages. If so, please get in touch with the Centre of Educational Neuroscience and we can discuss this. There's also a question around other neuromyths, and indeed we've only focused on 5 common neurodevelopmental disorders, but there's also obviously neuromyths related to learning difficulties such as dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and we see this as the starting point, and maybe we have already PhD students in the Centre of Educational Neuroscience who are looking at other groups, so there will be probably more resources coming out from there. But more question is around, you know, we spoke about working together, and there's a question from Alexandra asking around, well, are there any structures in place for a continuous multi-stakeholder conversation? And if so, what should that look like? You know, I think it's a challenging question for us maybe to think about. I don't know, Jamie, I might be putting you on the spot here, but we've had some conversations about that, and I don't know whether you want to say something as part of NeuroSENse. Is doing a number of activities, I think. So I don't know whether you want to highlight some of those.
Yes, I mean, it's really just in a very kind of early stages, but yeah, just looking to see if we can support in our position as a National Association of Special Educational Needs and some of that knowledge translation work of not only kind of sharing and disseminating research and having those conversations, but also supporting the research community to understand what some of the bottom-up priorities might be in terms of things that we're interested in looking at. It is very much stuff that we're just starting to dip our toe into the water with a few different projects that we're looking to try to disseminate to see if they can be scaled up, and also looking at sharing practice within schools as well. So really just trying to break those silos open and to facilitate those conversations. But in terms of a kind of a formal platform, we're not there yet, although Joe and I have some crazy and less crazy ideas around ways that we can try to look at that.
Thank you, Jamie. An interesting question here from Chloë to say, okay, so where do the parents fit in all of this? It's an excellent question. I don't know who's willing to take that one from the panel. Yes, Chloë, thanks. I was hoping you're going to raise your hand.
I don't know that I have a very good answer to it, but I think it's absolutely essential, for example, when we think about deaf children, because parents are needing to make a decision from day one, or at least as soon as they get the results of the newborn hearing screening, they need to make a decision from that very, very early stage as to what communication methods they are going to use with their children, with their deaf child. And so, yes, parents need to be involved from the start, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's also something that came again from our focus groups as well, where we looked at, teachers who were also parents, etc. And is that, very often parents are the experts when it comes to some of the needs that their children may have, specifically when we talk about rare genetic disorders or more complex development learning needs, for example. So this is why we also are raising the awareness campaign more as blogs and also video explainers that are accessible not only to educators and practitioners, but also to parents, obviously. I don't know whether anyone can help me, Matt, because there's so many questions. If you want to kind of maybe pick out a few.
I'll leap in there just to add, Joe, that there's a very recent study come out on autism and possible interventions for infants and young children with autism that demonstrated that one of the most effective interventions, and these are children viewed at high risk or showing early signs of kind of social disengagement. One of the most effective interventions was one that just targeted the parents, not the child, and that worked with the parents to give them help in understanding the kind of ways that the style that the infant wanted to socially engage and how that was different, and enabling the parents to respond to the infant's bid, which was sort of unusual for social engagement. So that indicates, I think, that the role of the parents is super powerful, but it's also a research question about how you can help the parents to help their child maximally when you're seeing slight differences in the developmental trajectories.
Just to jump in and add on to that one as well, I think when we're looking at, how neuromyths start and looking at communicating science findings, I think that study was quite an interesting one to look at how that could have been misunderstood, because again, there was implicit in that could have been this idea that it's the parents' fault. And moving back to those ideas of refrigerator mothers. And when you look at the detail of the paper, it's not that at all. But it's again, helping to better understand that communication and how that information is communicated to people. I think that was a great illustration, that paper, of where it could have been misunderstood and where the media particularly jumped onto it as well. And I think that's, you can see there where almost those myths then have their genesis, as it were.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. There's a question from Sean about, are schools the best learning environment? I'm going to pass this one first to Chloë, if that's okay.
I was so excited to see this question, Sean. Thank you, because it's actually a question, or a version of a question, that I've asked my Masters in Educational Neuroscience students this week to think about. We have to remember that schools are actually very recent inventions in human cultural history. So for most of our time on Earth, children have not been learning in schools. They've been learning in their family, in their sort of wider community. Are schools the best learning environment? I think schools are very good for a lot of children, but we need to remember there are lots of different ways of doing schools. There are lots of alternative methods like Montessori, like Steiner, Reggio Emilia, Forest School. A lot of parents, including parents with children of special educational needs, choose to educate their children at home rather than in the school system because they don't feel that the school system works. And there are lots of supports in place for parents who choose to do that. So I think rather than thinking our schools the best learning environment, we need to think about what are the different types of learning environments that schools can provide and what features of those learning environments are successful and for which children. One of the difficulties of working that out is that there are very few good quality evaluations of Montessori, of Steiner, of Reggio Emilia, of Forest Schools, very few good evaluations. The evidence base is growing for Montessori, but it's still relatively small. So a really good question. I love that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chloë. And indeed, this was a comment from some of the other panel, people on the chat. I'm sorry, there's a lot of them. I'm saying around, sometimes for some of the neuromyths, there isn't quite clear evidence yet. And we might also, it's not only around what's a neuromyth and what isn't, but it's around what has been evaluated already and what isn't. And to keep on building on that evidence is something we can keep on doing, whether it's on neuromyths or types of schooling, as we say, and what works and what doesn't work. I'm going to go to a question in the Q&A because actually, there's one there from Jessica Massonet around, when you look at the paper, and I didn't present the data in full today, but, the point is that on average, the respondents do have a score in 3 out of 4, so getting it correct. And I'm just going to correct that. It's not that the average score was, oh, sorry, yeah, you're right. The average was 3 out of 4 for all of them, but we do. And so the question that Jessica has is around how much we think neuromyths are a problem compared to maybe more of the structural problems, such as access to specialist services that we might see. And I think it's a great question, Jessica, but yes, overall, they're getting a good score, but there's lots of differences that some neuromyths are really very much endorsed by over 80% of the people we surveyed. And again, this is where it kind of shows that some neuromyths are very persistent and they do really have an impact on the support that children receive in classrooms, or the fact that they may not get specific support that they do need, as we've highlighted tonight. So thank you for raising that. I think it's around, we might want to see around which, and this is why we focused in our awareness campaign on certain neuromyths and not all of the ones that we've surveyed, but focused on some of those more persistent ones that seem to be harder to address or to get across. Matt, were there any more other questions?
Yeah, there's a question from Varna that might be one for you, Joe. I don't know. It's about gender differences in autism, and she's asking, given the much higher diagnosis of autism in boys, could it be that the diagnostic tools used to assess autism are not sensitive enough to pick up autism in girls? Do you think autism manifests differently in girls/women compared to boys/men? If yes, are there core traits associated with autism in girls that school professionals could look out for?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I won't have the full answer, I think, in terms of being able to highlight all the core difficulties that girls specifically, or autistic girls may have. But to give a bit of a history around, first of all, it was always believed that autism would only occur or mainly occur in boys through the kind of certain theories around, the male brain, for example, that was proposed. And indeed, there are issues with the tools that we have to assess autism in girls, because in my experience, girls tend to show less of the one of the neuromyths you mentioned, Matt, around, avoiding social situations, being more shy, not showing eye contact. Those differences in autistic girls are just more subtle. So they're there, just like the behaviors we see in boys, but they're just much more subtle. And that would be my best answer for now, for tonight. Yes, Jamie, I know you've got a lot more experience here. Thanks for stepping in.
Just No, I mean, absolutely. I would just say, from a practitioner's perspective, I think it's great that, it's been brought to our attention, the potential misdiagnoses amongst girls, because we have those stereotypes around autism and how it presents, that can also move into just kind of stereotypes around gender norms. The one thing I think we would just need to guard against is not then constructing a female way of presenting with autism and saying, well, she's not presenting like a girl would present, so therefore it can't be autism. So it's important that we recognize that girls may present differently, but that we don't necessarily build a list of this is how they should present. And I think it speaks to a broader point as practitioners, that with a greater knowledge and understanding around SEN, we've almost seen an accidental shift back towards a kind of medical model of focusing on looking at these discrete differences and almost this emphasis on a need for diagnosis. Whereas as a practitioner, our skill is diagnosing need. And so it's recognizing there's a need that this child or young person has that I'm currently aware of. Now, a clinician might come in and look and say there's a specific diagnostic label attached to it, and there are certain benefits to that. But in terms of me as a practitioner, it shouldn't necessarily significantly change the practice I'm putting in place, because that need remains. The need I first identified, if it might be a need around social communication or a need around play, I'm going to put support in place for that. I don't need to wait necessarily for a clinician to come and tell me it's autism or whatever it might be. I'll still certainly flag that to my Senko and various people, but as a practitioner, it shouldn't necessarily change my practice, because I've identified a need and I can then put support in place for that. And we just don't conflate early intervention with early diagnosis.
Thanks very much for that, Jamie. Yes. I think, it might be time for coming to a close for tonight, but would welcome any final thoughts or comments from the panel. Or anyone wants? No, I think we're all done. Okay. Well, then the only thing I can do is thank you all very much. For those of you who've attended, for all your questions and comments. I'd like to thank all the members, the panel members for tonight, who are also members, obviously, of the NeuroSENse team, for all the creation of the awareness campaign, resources and materials. And if you do get a chance to look at our materials online, there is a chance for you to leave any comments. Please feel free to share them with as many people as you think will benefit from these resources. And if there are any other things you'd like us to focus on, we do like to work with practitioners and to listen to what you have to say. So do let us know. That's all for me to say. Thank you very much.